Good evening, everyone. We're sorry for the delay. We're about to get started, but before we get started, I'd like to say a few words about attendees and interpretation today. This is an important message for all attendees. In order to hear interpreters in today's meeting, you must select your language preference. Click on Interpretation in the meeting options and select English or Spanish. If you do not select a language preference, you will hear both English and Spanish. Again, click on Interpretation in the meeting options and select English or Spanish. My name is Ramona Khan, and I will be your moderator for tonight's meeting. Before we begin, I have some important ground rules to share. You've all been muted upon entry and will remain muted unless you've been called to speak. The members of the Wage Board are unmuted so they can speak at any time. Any distracting video will be disabled. And please note that today's meeting is being recorded. At this time, I am pleased to welcome and introduce the Wage Board Chair, Brenda McDuffie, who will start the meeting. Madam Chair, you may now begin.
I thank you very much, Ms. Khan, our moderator for this evening. And I'd like to say good evening again to you and welcome to our Farm Laborers Wage Board meeting this evening. As you heard, I am Brenda McDuffie, and I'm very honored, and I want to thank Commissioner Reardon for allowing me the opportunity to serve as chair of the Farm Wage Board. And I welcome all of you who, again, have taken this time out of your schedules to be with us this evening for the meeting. And it's such an important topic, and I think the attendance and your continued participation and engagement shows the importance that we all know that this topic has to the lives, livelihood, and the economy of the state of New York. I'd like to introduce my fellow board members who are here with us this evening and also like to thank them. With us tonight is Mr. David Fisher, and David represents the Farm Bureau. And then we have Mr. Dennis Hughes, and Dennis represents the New York State AFL-CIO. I'd like to acknowledge our Department of Labor support team. That's been awesome during this process. And I'm going to say hello to Mike Pigilano. And Mike, I'm going to call you Mike P from now on. And you're going to give me some tutoring on the appropriate enunciation, so I apologize. And a name I don't have any problem with, Milan Blount, our Deputy Commissioner for Worker Protection. And so they've been an awesome team along with other members of the department's staff during this entire process with the board, as well as with people from the community that have decided to, again, spend time with us, speak and share their knowledge and information. Before we move along in tonight's meeting, there are a couple of things, like Ramona said, that we want to remind you of, that we are conducting simultaneous translation during the meeting. So I hope you all went so that you can take note of your appropriate language in the interpretation button. I'd ask you, and it's really my fellow board members who'll be speaking, to please speak slowly so the interpreters can ensure that the information is communicated. This is an open public meeting, and as such, it is being recorded. The recordings will be available on the Department of Labor's website, and that website address is labor.ny.gov. You can find more details on the work that we've been doing as a wage board on that site also. And I just want to remind you that we have received testimony from the public, and our closing date for all testimony to be submitted closed on October 31st. Transcripts of the testimony will be available on the website in English and in Spanish. And that website address again is labor.ny.gov. .gov. So please avail to that. The members of the board, and I can attest to this, have certainly received large packets of the information provided. And I know that each member has taken the time to read through any written documents that were provided, as well as, we really took note of the testimonials that were provided orally at our public meetings. With that, I'd like to open up today's reflections of our discussion last night, the information we received and have received and pondered over and thought about and digested by opening up the floor to, I'll start with David Fisher, and then I'll go to my fellow board member, also Dennis Hughes. So David from the Farm Bureau. Any comments or reflections?
Sure. I guess I'd just like to start out by saying, with the discussion, I think it's obvious that the minimum wage has gone up, and the pay of a lot of our farm workers is well above minimum wage. Some of the stats from yesterday that I presented showed that it's more than what some of the median farmer actually even earns. And we heard testimonies of farm families that were actually on food stamps. And so if that's the case, where do they get money to pay their overtime? I don't know if you've heard or familiar with FarmNet, but it's a consulting that comes through Cornell, state funded, to help with mental health and business planning for stressed farms. They have many counselors across the state, and they are overwhelmed in what they can, more demand than what they can meet. So that it's probably not from people that are making too much money. So it's just another example of the stress that's in the farm community. I guess in all these proceedings, I'm a little bit disappointed that we have not heard as much from Department of Ag and Markets as I think we probably should have. Why has Commissioner Ball not been in this process or been muzzled? I don't know. I've asked a couple of times. Would give one the appearance that maybe something is stacked against us, but I believe in the law. It did say in Department of Labor in consultation with Ag and Markets. So I think we need to look into that a little bit. From some of the discussion yesterday, I was a little bit concerned with the direction, and I'd just like to clarify the wage board's charge, and it's not to go below 60 hours to 40.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The statute says that the overtime rates recommended by the wage board shall not be in excess of 60 hours, and the wage board shall specifically consider the extent to which overtime hours can be lowered below such amount set in law, and may provide a series of successfully lower overtime thresholds and phase-ins as part of its determination. Nothing for sure. It says may.
Mm-hmm.
Wage board shall consider existing overtime rates in similar situated industries in New York State. So what it doesn't say is that overtime must be lowered.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess, a few other things, question maybe for Dennis. If you vote to lower the overtime threshold to 40 hours a week, that will be the effective ceiling for farm employees. Workers will lose money in their paychecks every week. The result may be that they leave to work in other states where they can earn more money and have less labor protections. Or in many situations, in some of these other industries, we see a lot of people with second jobs, and they may be forced to do that. So is that better than one job that would provide 50 or 60 hours? I guess I don't think so, but maybe. Also, if people need to hire more workers, they'll likely not have the ability to provide more housing. And free housing is a big benefit that may go away. Finally, I would say if hours are cut, you probably can expect an increased demand for farm worker services like agribusiness child development centers, migrant health clinics. But with state funding in dire straits, I don't know if that will happen. And I guess my question is, will this really all benefit workers? You know, Dennis, you used the word parity a lot yesterday. If that's important, will the AFL-CIO advocate to get rid of mandatory overtime on the 7th day of work and grant farms the ability to have salaried professionals on their farms? No other industry must deal with these issues. And I don't see a lot of parity in that. I know that's not part of this hearing, but it needs to be said. New York is not on an island. Businesses of all types have to compete with wage rates, labor costs of other states and other countries. You both talked about how businesses have to adjust. Farms are price takers. Farmers testified to this. I've said it before, and we heard it multiple times. We take what we get. We don't get to set our commodity prices. They're set in national and international markets. And to the fact that processors and others in the food chain have adjusted, I think some have adjusted by moving out of state. We have left in the state one cherry processor. Peaches, we have 0. Sauerkraut, we used to be the sauerkraut capital. We have 0 left. We lost the last one a couple years ago. Apples, we only have 2 left. And a lot of our juice apples are now being imported from Pennsylvania and as far away as Michigan because of the lower costs. People can undercut our growers. Another thing that farmers have always been in New York, very generous. Food donations. Over the years, we've donated 8 to 10 million pounds a year to food banks. That's on the downtrend, and I see with more overtime costs, it probably won't happen. It probably will get plowed under. And we heard that from many different farmers. If you vote to lower the overtime threshold on farms after less than a year, the new 60-hour threshold, the two of you have the potential to fundamentally change the look of New York agriculture in the short and long term. Because once farms go out of production, they very rarely come back. The state has spent millions of dollars on Nourish New York to provide fresh fruit, milk, and vegetables to food insecure people in New York, presumably in many of your communities. It's not a scare tactic to say that this locally accessed food probably will drop. And what will you say to your neighbors when these things go away? Farms will go out of business if the threshold goes down. It's as simple as that. Farms are already closing down. As I talked about some of the statistics yesterday again. Some can see the handwriting on the wall. The wage board seems like in some ways has turned into a state-sanctioned farm realty agency, and the number of listings is increasing. Signups for solar, which may be the most profitable thing with some of this farmland, is going up rapidly. It's a sad thing to see some of the prime farmland being signed up for solar sites. And we're in the middle of a pandemic, and we haven't even had a year. So people love to say they'll help farmers adjust and deal with increased costs. Lawmakers said that on the floor of the legislature last year, but did we see any assistance? Shall we expect anything when the state's facing a major deficit? It doesn't look very good. I think farmers have been willing to work in good faith on a reasonable solution. And to the comments yesterday about 80 years of no regulation or minimum, we have had regulations, it's just different. And maybe our forefathers were more connected to the realities of what goes on in food production and farm work on a daily basis and had a better idea. Because I'm not sure everyone fully understands really where we're all coming from and what we do. But everyone did come together to try to make that happen a year ago. One of the things I clearly remember was 300 plus farm workers in an onion shed in Western New York. Senator Ramos was there and many others. And that's where the 60 hours conversation really came from. And we've had in our hearings, Assembly and Senate members from both sides of the aisle said, it's not time for a change yet. We heard that from Farm Credit, Cornell, farmers, and farm workers. New York agriculture has been proactive on many fronts to improve working conditions, promote farm safety, implement training protocols, establishing ag workforce development programs, protecting employees from COVID, and providing good worker benefits. But we can only do so much before the negatives outweigh the positives. Taking away the livelihoods of farmers and farm workers is not the answer. As I talked yesterday, the pendulum has swung. We've made significant improvements for workers and worker safety, and worker programs. But anytime the pendulum swings too far, too fast, there are always serious unintended consequences. And that's where my reference to good governance comes in. Does thoughtful, proper due diligence, and we need to look at all sides of important issues before we make any changes. So that's where I've basically been coming from, and that we need a pause. We need to look at the data. We need to look at the whole food system before we continue to make any other changes in this overtime rule. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. Appreciate your comments, your reflection, and continuing to bring us good information for consideration and deliberation. So I thank you. I know that you presented Dennis with a number of questions, but I'm going to ask Dennis if he'd like to respond and or just share with us first your reflections, and maybe part of that will be a response. Dennis?
Well, I think I made myself clear yesterday. I thought I did. I understand where David's coming from,
Mm-hmm.
but and I do think that a pause would be a reasonable way to go, as long as that pause leads over a period of years towards a path towards a 40-hour requirement for overtime. We're not asking, David mentioned do this in a year. I think you mentioned that, Dave. I wouldn't think that would be reasonable. I think that farmers do need time to adjust to the new rules. But I, again, feel that it's very hard to justify one industry alone in the state of New York that is exempt from a reasonable overtime requirement. We're willing, at least from our point of view, the AFL-CIO point of view, willing to work out a schedule, a phase-in, if you will, over time. Not a year, not 2 years, and we'd have to figure out how long that time would be. But I think we should. I think our position is clear that over time, over a reasonable period of time, we get to a 40-hour overtime requirement, just like every other industry throughout the state of New York. I understand if we did it today, we did it tomorrow, David, you'd have a real problem, and that problem would be justified. And it would be unreasonable to enforce that or even put that upon you. But over time, it is a reasonable request to get to a 40-hour overtime rule. The question for us on this board is what that amount of time is, at least from my point of view, what that amount of time will be. What is reasonable, what is feasible, and what is fair.
And I think, Dennis, that depends on a lot of factors. In a few years, if we can afford it, I'd be happy to pay it. But if we still can't, and if the pricing mechanisms and other things haven't changed, how can I sit here and say, yes, we'll agree to something that we don't know the ramifications and the outcomes down the road? That's where I'm at.
Okay.
I've tried to say that, right along, that an economic analysis and a study and a look at the whole food system is what we need, not just a plan to say in 3 or 4 or 5 years we start a ratchet down. We need to look at it in a bigger picture, is my opinion.
Yeah, I hear some common threads. And Dennis, I want to thank you for your reflections and responses. And, both of you have used a word that I think is very appropriate for our conversation and deliberations, and that's reasonable. And it's the details of what is within that scope of something that would be reasonable um, as a solution, workable, and comes to a sensitive balance. I do appreciate that there at least seems to be a sentiment around this notion of that we really have to take the time, and it's nothing that can, as you use the word, David, swing the pendulum so significantly that we wind up hurting both the workers as well as the farmers. And so I think we have at least began to uh, come to use common language around over time, and I mean over a period of time, and potentially some sort of phase-in process where we can look at the impact of the decisions and of the deliberations to ensure that we can protect workers, as well as make sure that we have a good, sound industry for people to work in within New York State. And I really feel that we possibly could get there because I think everyone recognizes what's at stake. And what's at stake is really not only people's lives and quality of life, but also whether or not we even have a agricultural economy for people to be able to work in. So I'd like us to really kind of reflect on that. And I'd like to just respond to something that I heard you say, David, and that was a request for the Commissioner for Ags and Markets to be in consultation. I can assure you that they are and are in their respective responsibilities within their roles in the state of New York, both the Commissioner of Labor and the Commissioner of Ags and Markets will continue to share information with each other as they have not only during this process, but at the conclusion of this process. So that dialogue will continue. And I think you're absolutely right. And we're good enough to bring our charge to us. We were not charged to necessarily lower the rate, but it was after these deliberations that we were going to come to something of an agreement as a board that we could vote on that would utilize all the information we gained and the sensitivity and importance of it for this particular industry that would allow us to draw a conclusion about whether we maintained, lowered, and then how that happened, at least within a particular, as we've reflected, maybe a phase in or a time period. So I appreciate that. reminder also. Um,
I guess the only other thing I'd say is we are not the only group that doesn't have overtime. There are church and nonprofits, and what about all the people that work in Albany for political people? None of them get overtime, and they work way more hours. So there's a lot of others that are not in that.
Not many, David, not many.
Is not, yeah.
Not
And
many.
those individuals, I've led
Yeah.
several not-for-profits, and you have your classifications of exempt and non-exempt, and we
Yeah.
pay overtime. In fact,
It's a
labor
lot.
has and will come down on you if you abuse individuals, and we don't want to be doing that. And so I think, certainly whatever the legal provisions of are the law, we want to see every industry sector uphold those. And I think that is the case, as I know it, in the not-for-profit sector. In the faith-based sector, I think you have a different kind of connection, and it's usually as a volunteer in that sector. So,
Okay.
yeah. So, are there any other comments to this evening? If
I have none.
not, Dennis? Did you say
No, I have none.
Okay. I just asked you to go back and think about, our definition of what would be reasonable for you. And I'll think about what would be reasonable for me. And maybe on Thursday, which is our next scheduled time to get together, we can hopefully come to some conclusions and or recommendations. So I will conclude this evening's meeting. I'd like to again thank everyone for joining us this evening. Remember, the information will be posted on the Department of Labor's website, and that's labor.ny.gov. And again, as you know, this is very important matter. We're in a very strange situation of a lot of uncertainty in our market in not only New York State, but worldwide. And that's why we're meeting like this because of COVID. And I want to thank you for taking your time and spending your time with us as we work on this very important matter that will affect all of us. And so again, thank you very much. Be safe, have a good evening, and please stay well. And we have a meeting scheduled for Thursday at 4 p.m.